Yes, we are live, ma'am. You can start.
Okay, sir. So, a very warm good morning to all of you. I'm thoroughly pleased to witness you all here in this refresher course, and it's my privilege to address you all on the behalf of whole organizing team. I welcome all the participants in the third day of FTP course, and we are truly delighted with your presence in online mode of the program. Hope all the participants are gaining and enhancing their academic understanding from this FDP and its modules. For today's lecture, we are with a very eminent scholar in the concerned area of the today's topic, Professor Purnamita Das Gupta ma'am. Briefing about her bio, Professor Purnamita Das Gupta is a chair, professor and head of the Environmental and Resource Economics Unit at Institute of Economic Growth, University of Delhi, and has been visiting professor at University of Cambridge, UK, Johns Hopkins University, USA. She has been an author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, Commonwealth Universities, UK, and she has contributed to modeling for India's nationally determined contributions and national communications to the UNFCCC. She has been member of several Government of India committees, including drafting of regulation on e-waste, natural resource accounting for the CAG, Supreme Court Committee on NPV for forests, and Committee to Evolve Environmental Standards for India. She has published widely in journals, books, and popular media. Her research has been supported by international organizations and by various ministries, including the Ministry of Environment, Forests, and Climate Change, Finance Commission of India, and Ministry of Urban Development, among others. So we are very delighted, ma'am, to be with you in today's FDP. And the topic of ma'am's lecture will be growth and sustainability and some economic concerns. And this lecture will provide an overview on the multi-dimensionality of sustainable development. It will use illustrations from climate change, forestry, and help to explore the economic dimensions of sustainable strategies and policies. I hope the participants will be gaining much more out of it. Again, on the behalf of whole organizing team, I welcome ma'am for being with us in this FTP, and thank you very much for being with us for today. So over to you, ma'am, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srivastava. A very warm welcome to all the participants, all the colleagues, faculty at Ramanujan College. And thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts on this topic of economic growth and sustainability, which has actually, gained so much prominence over especially the last 3 decades or so. Whereas environmental economics as a subject has existed for quite some time. In our country, we have had this philosophy and consciousness about the importance of the environment right through the generations. So it is nothing new to us if we talk about the importance of the environment and nature's contribution to people. We have all grown up listening to such stories. Some of us have lived those lives as well. But to put this into formal structures, to put it into our formal modern day decision making has posed several challenges. It also poses opportunities to think ahead. And with those introductory words, I would like to get into a little more details about some aspects of how we try to formalize this within decision-making processes, how we grapple with some of the challenges it poses. How do I go down my slides? It's not moving. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Visible.
So I want to start. Being an economist, I will start by talking about what we know as one of the most important issues, which is poverty. right? One of the issues, and I will start by showcasing what growth has done for us. So I am not one of those economists who goes to the extreme of saying that we don't need growth, or that a country like India or developing countries in general can do without growth. I will say that the size of the cake matters, because evidence proves to us that over the years, economic growth has contributed and helped countries in certain transitions, including getting out of poverty, demographic transitions. Yes, there are variations. And in India, for instance, we do have states which have, for instance, high life expectancy corresponding with relatively low per capita income. But all this is enabled to a large extent when you have the resources that economic growth generates. However, that is only one part of the story, because as growth has taken place, we also have a lot of evidence accumulating, particularly from the developed countries who were industrializing much earlier than us and adding to these huge economic surpluses, which, for a long time was the model for everyone else to follow. That we have seen two main things occurring. One is the increasing inequality that has taken place, right? Income inequality. And today in India also we hear that, how much that 80% of the income goes to, some estimates suggest that up to 80% of the annual income generated in the country goes to the top 30% of the population. So we are all getting exposed to these kinds of evidences on one hand. On the other hand, the other big problem that has happened is in the environmental arena. We are getting increasing evidence, whether it's of climate change, whether it's of degradation of forests, whether it is of increasing air pollution or declining water quality in our rivers. We are getting a sense of some of the problems that are coming as we grow. Now, on the other hand, we are also very aware that parallelly, there has always, for some countries like India, we have a rich tradition of this knowledge, but for some countries, it may be a realization as you grow along that there are other ways in which other things that people value in life other than, very high income levels. So whereas some people, there are contradictions, whereas some people value very, how much they can shop and how much income they have and status consumption and things like that. There are some others at the same time parallelly who actually value what is the meaning of life. And in fact, one study on the meaning of life, which was survey-based, showed that, there is an inverse relationship, particularly in the developed world, and as well as surprisingly some of the developing countries, that they prefer to be at some middle level of GDP per capita and retain some meaning of life. So meaning of life and happiness from life is not seen to linearly increase as your GDP goes up. Obviously, there are threshold levels which you have to maintain. So what matters, if I put it in, how do we bring this into our economic decision-making processes? We are all familiar about, this utilitarianism, maximizing utility, and things like that, which conventional neoclassical economics does. But here also remember there are two things. One is what you want to target as what you wish to achieve in the individual sense of maximization. So you could have, an individual could be maximizing their preference satisfaction, traditional, utility maximization, traditional, all the things that our indifference curves and demand functions teach us to do conventionally. But some may want to maximize happiness. Some may want to maximize their capabilities. We know status consumption matters for some people, and so on. So a lot of theories have come up on these. But there's another question also that has come up in society of how you distribute the total cake. Is it utilitarianism? Do we want everybody to have the maximum possible in terms of income? Or maximization of preference satisfaction, maximization of happiness? What is it you want? This is the distributional aspect in society. Do we want a Rawlsian principle? Do we want everybody to have just a certain sufficient base, which is known as sufficientarianism? What is the principle that we as a society wish to maximize? So you see, welfare is not one unique static concept. Welfare is multidimensional, and it gets into normative sort of thinking as we move ahead. Okay. And as economic growth is pursued, we have seen that it impacts certain dimensions of the environment positively and some dimensions negatively. So if you are able to see this picture, you can, on my screen, you will see how many kinds of natural capital, as we call it. So this is nature's capital, natural resources there are, and how many services as a society we get from natural capital, right? It's not just about viewing it or having pleasure from looking at the landscape. There are specific things that we derive out of nature, which is the idea of natural capital. And that is why it is entering into economic models now, gradually. So the conceptualization of sustainability, in some sense, is about the long run. So there was a time when we thought nature is bountiful, nature is endless, but then we have started facing the realities of what happens when the sink functions of nature, the ability to absorb what we throw back into nature, has been overwhelmed. Or the source function of nature, when we see nature as natural capital and we harvest something from nature, those functions get over-harvested beyond the ability of nature to regenerate, recreate, and keep on adding to itself. So we know, for instance, that our rivers have the ability, right, because of the natural system, to assimilate waste. But when we exceed, when we throw into our rivers much, much more than what rivers can naturally assimilate, can naturally clean themselves up with us in a very lay sense, we start seeing deteriorating water quality. Similarly with air pollution. So the whole sustainable development issues have started becoming more and more relevant for us. So now you have all these attempts to try and understand how in our economic decision-making processes and in the way that we want growth to happen, how do we also build in certain ideas of preventing environmental degradation, of not breaking the barriers, not breaking the boundaries of what could be a safe space for humanity to operate in. This is the notion of the safe operating space. There's the notion of planetary boundaries. There are boundaries of what this earth can sustain. Some of the most, Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, we are familiar with that some of his quotations we can actually trace back to what is today being formalized in terms of planetary boundaries or what nature can give and how much nature can support. So, for example, what is climate change discourse about? When you hear these terms about 1.5 degrees centigrade and 2 degrees centigrade, what are people saying? People are saying that warming of the Earth's temperatures till 1.5 degrees centigrade is more tolerable. It's a boundary as compared to warming, which goes up to 2 degrees centigrade. So what are you doing? You're relaxing the boundary till 2 degrees centigrade. And maybe we want to, and if we go on warming it beyond it, we'll go beyond what logically this boundary can be stretched to without having some adverse hit back on the planet, right? Similarly, we now want to bring into play into our decision-making ideas of tipping points, thresholds. We are aware, I'm sure we are all aware of some water body, for instance, somewhere, which has now turned into a drain because so much waste has been dumped into it, or a lake that seems to have died out because of, on one hand, excess water withdrawals and dumping on the other hand, which has disturbed the ecology of the lake. What sometimes is also called, could be a process of eutrophication, for instance, right? So we all are aware of such examples. So we say then that's a tipping point. Now it's an irreversible change. You can't bring the lake back anymore. Unless, of course, in some cases, you have to spend a lot. You have to spend a lot on bringing the water back and the water quality back to the levels that you are used to. Now, these may be, I'm saying this in a very sort of simple way because I want the message to go home. And on each of these topics, you will find that there's a lot of literature which if you are interested in, we can talk about in the discussion session, and I'm happy to share with you later. Okay, now, so just to elaborate on it, what do we have here? I want to, in the same idea of what is a safe operating space or what is a planetary boundary, you may have heard the idea of a carbon budget. People are talking about a global carbon budget and what is India, what should be India's share in this? So what is this? The idea is that, and as economists mostly, all of us, in fact, we know that we have budgets on which we run our homes, on which the economy runs. We had one budget being presented yesterday. So you see, the idea of climate change can be captured in this notion of a carbon budget. What is it? That there's a total budget of how much can be put into the environment. And that is the total carbon budget, the space that is available to planet Earth. And this is slightly outdated figures, but because this is still 2011 and the new figures have just come out from the IPCC's models, but if the total amount of carbon that the atmosphere can hold is 2,900 gigatons of equivalent to 2,900 gigatons of CO2, between 1870, roughly industrialization picking up by that time, to 2011, we had used up 1,900 gigatons. And now we are saying of this budget, about 1,000 was remaining in 2011. Now we have already moved another 10 years. So some amount of what is remaining has already been used up. Now it's come down. So estimates are varying a little bit, but somewhere between 800 and 700. But the idea being that, everybody, including humanity as a whole, has to operate within a budget. Okay. And we know now that there's a lot of evidence on very many impacts from climate change. Why is everybody so bothered? Why has climate change become this sort of icon or symbol of all that is wrong when you pursue single-mindedly growth without looking at what it is doing to the environment? So we know that India as a country is blessed heavily with natural resources. We also know that many parts of our economy still are dependent on natural resources. And many lives and livelihoods are connected with it in a very everyday sort of way. apart from what we put into, our supply chains and what we source from nature. That is one part of it. So we have to use nature with due care. The other part of it is that once you start putting all this carbon and greenhouse gases, as they are called, of which CO2 is the most potent, into the atmosphere, and the greenhouse effect takes place and there is warming, it leads to certain impacts. And those impacts could have very adverse consequences, not just for India, for the entire globe. That is the way climate change works. But unfortunately, being located as we are geographically, and given the diversity in our country, socially, culturally, biophysical terms, there will be certain vulnerabilities, among which flood risks and losses linked to them are expected to be very high. We are already seeing a lot of climate-related events. And similarly, heat. As it is, we have many, many areas of the country which reach very high temperatures in the summers. But this is linked. How does it get linked to the economics of it? Flood risks and losses, we can easily understand about the damages that will take place. Think of labor productivity. Think of all those who are in certain professions like traffic policing. Think of those who are working in terms of outdoor labor activities. Even those who go out in teams, and this is not just casual labor, wage labor, daily wage laborers. It is all those who are in sectors which force you to work outdoors across levels of labor and workers and managers, right? For example, those working in construction sites, those who go out for repair and maintenance work for our infrastructure, for instance. So the risk of heat strokes and all these impacts would be a lot. Again, a third part of it is, for example, we are so busy with trying to get our health infrastructure in place. COVID has shown us that how much our health system needs to be resilient to be able to cope in various ways. What we don't want is we don't want situations of increased floods, increased heat waves, which come back and hit us in the form of adverse health impacts. On one hand, we grow, we invest in health infrastructure and in building our cities and giving a better life to everybody, improving health, improving education. We don't want a situation where climate change comes back and hits us and takes these away from us. So from before, we want to be able to build our infrastructure in a way so that it is resilient. And as you can imagine, all this is about technology. It is about resources. It is about costs, finance. It's about planning. So I'm sure I don't need to say more about why this whole story of the environment links up actually with economic growth and how we pursue growth in a big way. So this was one example. So, and so let's see another illustration of how this causal chain works. So let's take the case of glacier melting, for instance. This is another thing that we are hearing a lot about, right? So you have increasing temperatures. Increasing temperatures lead to glacier shrinkage, lead to impacts on water resources. Most models are showing that initially you would have a surcharge, you would have more of flooding, higher flows in most of the rivers, right? Because your glacier is melting for some time. And you could have flood risks in places where you have never had floods before, or floods at times when you have not expected floods to occur, right? And in some cases, as this water distribution will change, right? Some places may well dry up as well as a fallout of it. And as you go further down, some models show that from hydrologists show that these same flood prone areas will now start drying up because upstream, your source of the water, the glacier has in any case shrunk. So further down the timeline, you see flows going down. So in a nutshell, you have a change in the water resources. Once water resources change, and I'm not even going to downstream effects of drinking water supply, upstream itself, you could see impacts on crops, on livestock, and in turn impacts on livelihood. So this is the way you see the signal goes down. But you see, growth matters. Why? Or how you develop, let's say, matters. Because parallelly with this process, you have a development process going on. What we want to say is, ideally, these two should be brought together and should match. So if I am building certain types of, say, settlements, because we want to expand our housing, we want to give safe shelters to everyone, then let me build it in a way that I accommodate the fact that I may have to build flood-resistant infrastructures. I may not, what is appearing as a very attractive spot for building my shelters today may not be so in 20 years' time. So let me take it into account. So let me do all my development activities at every phase, keeping this science and knowledge, which is already available, at least as much as is available, let me try and incorporate it in my decision making on where to invest my resources and how much to invest with. So I want to also share with you so there are many response signals also that are happening in our country. You know, environment is being talked about increasingly. Yesterday's budget spoke about giving a big boost to greening the economy. So, and you know, India has been is part of this, what is called the Paris Agreement. We have the nationally determined contributions where we have made certain voluntary commitments at the international level under the UNFCCC that we are going to do certain things, reach certain targets in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of how we adapt to climate change. So for climate change, there are two terms. One is adaptation, one is mitigation. Mitigation is what we do to reduce how much carbon we put into the air or how much of the greenhouse gases we put up there. Adaptation is the idea that we know we are warming, we know that it is inevitable that some warming will happen. And because of that warming, we will feel certain consequences, such as excessive heat in some parts of the country. And what do we do in order to tackle those consequences? So one of our most, you know, there have been many sort of initiatives that are on, and I'm sure other lectures will talk about these. Many sort of policy instruments that have been put in, that are being discussed all the time. Many sort of policy responses that have taken place. We have the National Action Plan on Climate Change. We have the national missions to take up those plans and to put them on ground. One of these is developing health action plans. And specifically, I want to share with you one set of things that has happened, that is a heat action plan for some of our cities. Ahmedabad in Gujarat was the first, where a heat action plan was developed. Now you have Bhubaneswar and some other cities also where these are being developed. So the idea being, and this is a very positive development, these are in place. The idea being that, you know, we are preparing, we are investing in a way that is going to take on board the idea that environmental changes can impact your developmental outcomes and your well-being. So if you're interested, you you can see the Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan. There's quite a bit of literature published around it as well. So in a nutshell, what am I saying? I'm saying the quality of growth matters. Economic growth, I would urge, and this is my viewpoint, is not a social objective in itself. And our policy focus, as we know, is always on achieving certain social objectives, not a standalone economic objective. The economic objective feeds into achieving a social objective. And once we look at social objectives, we start understanding the importance of handling distributional issues in the country, handling intergenerational issues, and to understand that any investments that we do will have implications for the future. So imagine building some very important infrastructure in a riverine area that is prone to floods. Now, this is something, if you know about the flood today, you know it floods, you won't do it. You won't have what are known as stranded assets by investing money there. But imagine that you don't know about it today because it hasn't happened in the past, but it may happen because of some developmental activity that is done upstream of the river. So downstream, you may have flooding tomorrow, or because you have some, say, climate or weather related event, which will start happening 10 years later. In either case, let's try and get as much of the science that we can believe in with confidence in terms of the environment into our decision-making processes today, so that we are not left with stranded assets and in the near future. And the best way of going about ensuring that our growth is of a quality that we wish it to be, which enables social objectives, which enables us to maintain a standard of living, to ensure a quality of life for everyone, is we use multiple indicators. So we don't use only GDP, for instance, when we try to judge growth. We also are talking about supplementing it with a green GDP, right? So now you're hearing talk about green GDPs, okay, increasingly. Where, what do you do? Along with the conventional way of looking at GDP, you are also adjusting the GDP for depreciation in natural assets, for appreciation in our natural assets, if that happens. So if air quality deteriorates, or if forests are lost, can we bring that into our asset accounting? Or similarly, if our water quality improves, is there a way that we can bring it into our asset accounting for the country and our income flow accounting, which is what the GDP does. I will give you one small example before I move on to my next section. We all know that logging is a part of our GDP accounting, right? National income accounts, when we do it, we add logging, timber and logging, right? But the more logging you have, the more a state's income or a country's income, whether it's a state domestic product or the GDP, goes up, because that shows up as an income. But what happens when the more logging you have may lead to a situation where you have actually lost those trees, particularly if you have done your logging and timber harvesting in an unsustainable way at a rate much faster than what natural regeneration can happen. So you've lost that tree. So the asset value has come down, and in future, that source of income, which could be added to the state domestic product, has gone down. So you see, this is where doing a GDP and a green GDP, or having a dashboard of indicators rather than one indicator to judge our growth, is recommended. Okay, so now I will just, And there's a lot of evidence that is lot of science that is increasingly coming up, right? On loss of biodiversity, increasing disasters, floods, droughts, landslides. So we have no dearth of evidence on why the environment is eating into every aspect of development now, right? We can't ignore it. That's the message I want to keep. So let me show this one. So let's look at it again. Now, one more aspect that I want to sort of discuss with regard to why the environment matters. And we need to move from just economic growth to economic growth with sustainability. You know, when we apply our minds, we realize how much of what we see in a very processed, packaged form, maybe in our urban centers, and on the other hand, what actually goes into lives and livelihoods in many of our non-urban centers is sourced actually from nature. And I'm sure we all know this, right? So a big area of work, therefore, within economics that has come up is the valuation of nature, right? And how this impacts decision-making. So here are two examples. One is where communities do self-consumption. How do you value that consumption? Currently, often it goes unrecorded anywhere as to how much, but that is a part of it. Similarly, how do you value many other ecosystem services? So here's another example on your right, where there is this, you know, this livestock herder, and so the bank manager has come to give him a loan, and he says, I know my wealth is in my livestock. I don't know what its value for the bank is. And the manager is also wondering how he places a value on it, right? We know that market values can give you some direction, but often they don't give you the whole range, capture the entire value. So one big area of work in economics is the valuation of all the services we get from nature. Finally, I will spend another 5-7 minutes on this as I wrap up, on sharing with you one aspect of how do you respond. So now we've established that there's a link between growth and development. We've established that there are many different dimensions to this whole idea of how you can enhance welfare in society by including the environmental aspects. Because even if you look at economic growth only, economic growth will get impacted by the adverse consequences of environmental degradation. We've also know that there are a lot of actions and policy responses that are happening within the country. And one of the things that has happened for some time now as a response to environmental degradation is the attention that has gone to the forestry sector. Now, how does it, I want to leave you with some sharing on how the Finance Commission has been involved in helping us protect our forests, and what the thinking has been. And I've had the opportunity to actually contribute to some of these discussions. So I'm assuming that most of us know what the Finance Commission is. The Finance Commission of India is a body set up under the Constitution. And we know that the Finance Commission is set up every 5 years to look at how fiscal transfers are to be made within our federal structure between the center to the state, from the center to the states. And so different states are allocated different amounts depending on certain criteria. These are known as the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. And as we all would appreciate, I'm sure, that typically over the years, these criteria that have been looked at have related to what is the population share, what is the differential in the per capita income level across states, and various other criteria have been used. What is interesting is that from 2000 onwards, and so this is not something very recent, but it is something that has really sustained, that over 2 decades now, the Finance Commission has tried to incentivize and encourage all the states to protect forests. And well, the Finance Commission is dealing with money. These are concrete numbers. And there have been fund allocations for forestry. And when you're talking about allocation across different states, you need concrete formulas to be able to do these allocations. So this is one very interesting area of work in the Indian context. And I would really encourage those of us who are interested in these aspects to look into this and see how exactly this has happened in the Indian context. There are some very complicated formulas that have come up, but when you look into them, you see the beauty of the way this discussion and the consciousness with which our finance commissions have functioned over the years. So just to and how they have designed these intergovernmental transfers for our forestry sector. And I will just share 2 or 3 ideas, because this is about how you formalize a concern for the environment into your policy scenario, into the policy landscape, and into actually translating that into helping states protect the environment. We all know about externalities, right? So states typically, I will finish in 5 minutes. If that is okay, can I have another 5 minutes?
Yes, ma'am, you can continue for a long time. No issue.
Okay, thank you. No, I don't want to bore everybody and put them to sleep also.
No, ma'am, it's very interesting, ma'am. We are aware.
Thank you so much. So, we know about externalities, but think about it like this. So states come and make representations to the commission to say, why they should get money from the center for all the development plans that they have. So 2 sets of thoughts come out with regard to forests. One is the argument that forests create negative impacts on state revenues. Why? Because when a certain part of a state's land is mandated by law to be maintained under forests, that there's an opportunity cost, as we all economists understand. And the opportunity cost is that you cannot use that land, you cannot convert that land for other income generating activities from which the state earns money, right? The state can generate jobs. So for example, if in the forested area, you could convert it into industrial or agricultural use, you would be creating jobs, you would be creating income, you would generate income. And through the taxes, the state would get resources, which in turn it could spend on many welfare schemes. And this is a perfectly valid opportunity cost argument. On the other hand, so these states said that, we have a fiscal disability, right? So this is a fiscal disability from the state's perspective. And it's a perfectly valid argument. And it's rooted in welfare economics, because the state is supposed to deliver certain services. Where does it get the resources from? The second argument that comes from these states is there is an ecological value. Our forests are very precious. Our forests help clean the air. Our forests help to prevent soil erosion. Our forests help water recharge. Our forests do a lot, right? Including carbon sequestration. But even if you leave out carbon for a minute, if you forget that part for a minute, there are a lot of things that forests do. And if you have a forest in state A, these benefits spill over downstream and spatially to other states as well. So these ecological values and services of forests, these ecological services of forests, or ecosystem services as we know them, have a certain value which does not get accounted for. So states which had their large share of their land under forests want compensation or a reward for maintaining these forests. And they say that this should come out of the total budget, because the share of other states who benefit from the ecological values should be cut into, because they are enjoying certain ecosystem services which are not accounted for and are not paid for. So two sorts of arguments. One is reward a state for its ecological value. One is compensate a state for its fiscal disability, both rooted in economics ideas. One is an externality, the positive externality of maintaining land under forests. One is the fiscal disability or the opportunity cost. One is an opportunity cost argument, the other is an ecological value. In a perfect world with perfect accounting, with perfect models and prices, perfect accounting and social and prices, we would have been able to match the two, right? There would have been no difference. But we know it's not a perfect world. We know even economics doesn't have the tools to do these exercises as yet. So the Finance Commission brings together both arguments in trying to develop formula and evolve criteria, design a formula by which it can actually allocate money, balancing these different arguments. And you will see that every Finance Commission, therefore, has, at least since 2000, or I would say at least since the 12th Finance Commission to start with, has tried to do this balancing and tried to do this devolution. So this is an example of a great policy landscape response to a very, I would say, to an environmental problem. And you know, the amounts that we are talking about are not small. The total amounts that the Finance Commission has devolved for this have been quite a bit. So the 13th, which started with, so the 12th Finance Commission gave rupees 10 billion. By the 13th Finance Commission, rupees 50 billion, the total that was allocated. And then by the 14th Finance Commission, instead of a separate grant, actually brought the allocation and a very sophisticated and fairly sophisticated, I won't say very, but fairly sophisticated formula, and gave it weightage of 7.5%, along with the other conventional criteria that were used for allocation of the money to different states. So along with population, along with income differentials, we were also looking at forestry as part of the formula. And between the period 2015 to 2020, going by RBI estimates, about over 4,000 billion rupees was actually allocated, was devolved, let's say. The 15th Finance Commission, which is now ongoing, in fact, enhanced the weightage to the forestry component of the devolution formula to 10%. And initial estimates suggest that roughly about 1,500 billion has already been devolved over the year 2020-21. So this is the policy response. And I would say that, you know, there are many challenges in this. I don't have the time to share with you how interesting this whole design space is when you try to actually get the environmental aspects into your, and marry them into the, or mainstream them into your ecological, into your conventional economic decision-making space. But it's doable, it's done. And this intergovernmental fiscal transfers is one great arena where the Indian government has been engaged. Just to leave you why this ecological value matters, you see, across states with very different types of vegetation, with very different types of shares of area in different states under forests, you can see, if I were to devolve the entire allocated amount in terms of a formula that only compensates for fiscal disability, different states, the amount that they would have in the total share, suppose it's 1,000 billion rupees, the distribution you can see would be as per the chart on the left, which has, and the length of the bar tells you how much would be the share of different states in, say, this, imagine 1,000 billion rupees. But for the same states, in the same ordering of states on the x-axis, if I were to devolve the money, give the money only in terms of the ecological value of the standing forests in different states, you will see the distribution will be as per the graph on the right. So you can, now let's pick a state. So you see this, the second state is, or say, even if you look at the first state, which is Andhra Pradesh, see the length of the red bar on the left and the length of the blue bar on the right. You will see these are very different. So because our forests are very different, there's a very huge variation in the nature of the vegetation and the extent of the vegetation. So very careful considerations. A case for getting our values right, the correct way of valuing environmental resources, getting our numbers right. This is one very big job that economists have to do. There's another big job of designing and balancing different concepts within economics. How do they fit into different into the discourse, what you want on sustainability, and to be able to then do something that is judicious and acceptable. And therefore, this is also a huge area of challenges. It's not easy, but it is still possible. And this is what I wanted to, this is the thought I wanted to really leave you with through this example, that it's possible. It's possible to try and bring a lot of our economic economic concepts, ideas into this whole area of trying to reduce the risks we face if we upset nature, and through, you know, long-term environmental degradation of what we call exploitation of what we call natural capital, and to enhance what we call the resilience of our systems. Thank you very much for your patience. And I will stop here and be happy to discuss further and to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We have some participants with some queries, and they all say in comments very nice and very useful information. So they are also requesting to get the PPT of this lecture. If with your due permission, if you will permit us, we'll be sharing it with them on the portal. They are also asking for reference material, as they are feeling academic awareness regarding this area of sustainable development. So, ma'am, we have
will
some
share.
queries. Okay, ma'am. So we have some queries, ma'am. I'll put one by one. The first question is, can we establish causality between income inequality and environment degradation? If yes, please guide as to how to capture it.
Okay. So you want me to take the questions one by one?
Yeah, ma'am.
Okay. So there has been some work on this, not much. The income inequality, and one thing is you can do it, so for example, if you're looking at it from a slightly from two scales. One is if you're looking at it from a slightly macro scale. So you look at it as, so for example, you have district level data, right, on inequality. You have data on certain types of environmental, on the status of certain environmental indicators, right? And then you can do a mapping and see how it is changing. Okay, what is this partial distribution, right? And this, if you look at the environmental statistics that the CSO publishes every year, or at least once in 2 years at times, that will give you an idea of how the two map onto each other for India. That's the statistics part. Apart from this, what people have done, there are many ways to do this empirically. That is what I mean to say. So if that is the question you're asking, then empirically it's been done in many ways. There is also a lot of evidence, which is qualitative evidence, on how pockets of vulnerable population, right? Because you already have vulnerability in certain ways, including inequality, right? How those pockets their vulnerabilities get enhanced. So for example, when the environmental degradation hits, right? So for instance, if you're already located in a high temperatures in summer, in an area which experiences high temperatures in summer, if there is escalation of it further of the temperature, that will be an area that will be hit worse. Now, within that area, there is a certain income distribution, right? And it is not difficult to see that those who are if the income is more unequal, the impacts are likely to be more unequal as well. So imagine now that an early warning is given out, right? That the temperature is going to go up. We are expecting a heat wave over, and you send out an orange alert or a red alert. There are these different early warning systems in place now for several cities. So you get an alert, right? IMD forecasts it, you get an alert that there's going to be a heat wave. Now, what do you do about it? How are you able to respond to it? What precautions you're able to take would depend to a large extent on what your income is. Now, consider it from a policy planner's perspective also. So you have a certain set of resources, a certain set of plans, which you have to activate once the alarm, early warning is given out. And there's an alarm that, there's going to be a heat wave for the next 3 days, right? Now, how do you distribute your resources? Which parts of it do you strengthen will depend to a large extent on the income distribution in the city for which you're planning, or the municipality for which you're planning. I'll leave it at
that. We have the next query, ma'am. What is your suggestion to sustain and enhance stock of natural capital?
Okay, so the enhancing, okay, so first of all, I would say that it's a very, very valid, very important question. The first way to do it is to actually start investing our resources in a way that we take on board whatever available science is there on it, right? So then you are halting further degradation. That is one part of, maintaining your natural capital. So what economists do, for instance, there are different tools in our hands. For example, discount rates, right? At what rate do we discount the future? Okay. So we have seen that we have had increasing calls that suppose you discount financial capital, for instance, at a certain discount rate. The banks give certain discount rates when they're investing in a project. They apply certain discount rates, right, for doing a cost benefit analysis for a project, right, before they decide that is this worth funding or not, right? What has been argued is that for the environment, you should use a lower discount rate, which means that you are valuing the future and the long-term implications at a higher rate than you would for, say, financial capital. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in normal case, the discount rate logic is that a rupee is more value in hand today is more valuable than an equivalent amount tomorrow, right? So you discount the future. The future has a lower value than what you have in hand today is more precious than a promise of something of an equivalent amount tomorrow. You want to be compensated, right? You want more than a rupee if it is to be paid back to you next year. That's the logic of a discount rate. So the future is always discounted. But for natural capital, the argument being made is that if you want to sort of value your natural capital adequately and you want to keep it in place, you have to do the opposite. Or at least, so some people have said that, so you should stop doing this discounting the future business. You should use much lower discount rates than you would do for other capital, say financial capital, infrastructure capital. The kind of discount rates that you're using, use lower discount rates. So this is just an example of one thing. And they've even said use zero discount rate for natural capital. So this is just one example of the kind of policy instruments we have in hand to do this kind of decision making.
Ma'am, we'll take one or two questions, relevant questions only. One question is in relation to why the share of state Sikkim have much difference in fiscal disability and ecological value. Should I repeat the question, ma'am? One more is added over there. Ma'am, in relation to Goa and Sikkim, could you please explain the difference in final disability and eco-viability?
Sikkim and Goa, okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what, let me just put this up here. So what you're seeing over here is, you see, fiscal disability, your share can be decided by one of the criteria is within fiscal disability and ecological value, you put in this idea of the share of forests in the state, as well as the extent of forests, right? That's logical, isn't it? So suppose you have a large state, and there you have 20% of your land area under forests, and you're a small state which has 20% of the land area under forests. The two, you are not equally placed, right? Because a larger state also has a larger area which has gone away under forests. That is one way of thinking. And a larger state may also have a larger share of people, larger numbers, or for which it needs to provide certain state services, public services, whether it's health, education, infrastructure, road building, whatever it is, right? So there are two components to it for fiscal disability. One is the notion of equity, and the idea that those who have larger land areas, even in terms of absolute numbers, under forests, are more disabled than those who have lesser area under forests. Okay. So one is the shared concept, one is the absolute concept. So that is one part of the reason that you see these differences. On the ecological value, what really pulls the numbers in different directions is the ecological value, on the other hand, is determined to a large extent, of course, also by the species that you have. So, you know, in northern India, we have this thing, we call it Vilayati Kakkar, or you have invasive species, which is an invasive species, mind you. But you have trees which are very good, very strong in ecosystem values, and you have species which are not. Sometimes it is the biophysical characteristics, for example, whether you're subtropical or where you are located. Sometimes it is whether it's a deciduous forest or a non-deciduous forest or an evergreen type forest. So there are a lot of things about the species mix, the density of the canopy cover, how dense the forest is. So these things drive the ecological values, right? So what you're using criteria for understanding opportunity cost and what you're using for understanding ecological values are also very different, right? Which is why the numbers start looking very different. For certain states where there's a lot of difference, where these match, you will not see so much difference. The outcomes are not that different. But where it is, so for the smaller states in particular, you will see very different numbers. So you could be a very small state, right? And a large part of your area, like in Sikkim, is under forests, right? So fiscal disability argument is very strong. But depending on the kind of ecological values that those forests have, your share when you're going by ecological value may be lower. Does it sort of make sense?
Yeah, ma'am.
Similarly for
yes, ma'am. We have the last query, ma'am. Do we have any mechanism in place to account for the displacement due to environmental degradation and developmental activity? And how can we remove the inequality of economic growth of influence state?
Sorry, can you repeat that last bit? I missed.
Yeah, ma'am. Two questions I have combined. The last question was, one question I have added over here so that you can answer both of them at one time. How can we remove the inequality of economic growth of influence state? Should I repeat the first one, ma'am?
No, I'm just trying to note down the second, the inequality of economic growth
of influence state. I think it must be for influencing state. But
okay,
maybe the participant has written it wrongly.
Incentivize it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I think how do we incentivize states to address inequality, basically, something like that, the inequality that economic growth promotes. Okay. So I'm going to try and answer it as much as possible. I don't have all the answers, but I think from my perspective, the first question was on displacement. Now, you know, there is this idea that well-established idea that the way you go about it is that you do it through opportunity costs, right? That if there is displacement as a result of economic developmental activities, people should be compensated. That's the conventional neoclassical economics approach. And many of the planning that takes place across the world adopts this approach, right? So there are different aspects. For instance, if you're setting up a hydroelectric power plant and it leads to flooding in certain areas, then you would try and put together an R&R package, rehabilitation and resettlement package, which would adequately compensate people. Now, which would include costs of moving them somewhere else, or this is just an example I'm taking, and all that. But obviously, These are also, there are very many normative dimensions to this, right? So as a consequence, there are no perfect R&R packages. And there are normative dimensions which one can never compensate, right? So how do you compensate for getting uprooted from one place to another and all the social connections you have, or the historical or legacy connections you have with where you were? But sometimes these are necessitated in the larger interests of society. Let us also not forget that, right? So what is advocated is that there is no perfect model for doing this, but what is increasingly being talked about is more dialogues between affected and between immediately affected communities and the policymakers and managers, so that you put in place iterative, deliberative processes. So now they're saying, instead of that one way to come to the right numbers, because there will be no perfect compensation, and there will be no, you will not be able to compensate fully. There can be no full compensation, right? So displacement is very unfortunate. What you can do is avoid all activities to the maximum extent possible, do resiting, do relocations, to the maximum possible extent in your planning itself of the developmental intervention to the extent possible. And where you have to, where you do incur displacement, you try and put in place more deliberative processes to arrive at what is the most and the best way to compensate for this. For inequality of economic growth, now that's really something that I think a growth economist can do, answer much better than me. But perhaps what I would say from the sustainability perspective is, states are being incentivized. So for example, if you take the intergovernmental fiscal transfers, so it's not only about forests, right? So for one of it is about income differentials. So the divergence in income between the top 3 states, the differential in the average per capita income between the top 3 states and the average of that is taken, and the differential of, say, any state X from that, the difference in the per capita incomes is taken, for instance, in some of the Finance Commission formulas. And these formulas have differed a little bit. Sometimes you've taken only the top states. Sometimes you've taken 3 of the top states, the average of those. So, and then calculated the share that an individual state gets. So you're giving weightage to the fact that there is an inequality in the per capita income distribution across states. So at different levels, depending, you can put in place mechanisms for states to incentivize. Also, I think one of the big things about a democracy is that there is an answerability every time there's an election, right? At every level, right? Not just, I'm not talking about national level elections, at every level, more localized levels. And I think policymakers also realize that there is this need to essentially put in place an improvement in the basic quality or threshold of life, and to try and push that level all the time. If I come to the international level, then you have all these countries signing up for the SDGs, for instance. Again, that is a mechanism where you say the sustainable development goals, if you look at them, each of them has individual targets that countries are supposed to attain for every bit of subnational population, right? So a lot of different things at different levels. If you talk of incentivizing states, I think it's coming together of not just the economics. The economics can't do it on its own, is my bottom line. I think you have to get on board different sorts of disciplines, including the political economy, and we have to respect different levels of decision makers, which is again something that I think we always have to actively promote. Thank you.
Ma'am, thank you very much. Since it was a very fruitful and very gaining session, some of the participants has requested to recommend some books or reference materials regarding the discussion which we have made today. So if it is possible for now, or you can share with us, we will be sharing with the participants whatever is the possibility is there, so we can do it with. So, ma'am, it was now the end of the session. Time is over here, and thank you very much, ma'am, for highlighting the relevant perspectives relating to the sustainability. And I can see many of the topics has been discussed, like welfare is multidimensional, normative, idea of natural capital, aspects of sustainability, substantial economic impacts in which the labor productivity and the other issues has been discussed. Even the COVID pandemic situation has been quoted with the sustainability, that how it is resilient for the health sector, and the quality of growth matters, green GDP, non-market goods and services, a lot of things. So I'm sure the participants, the young faculties, and even we have got the academic wings to think about how we can go with this. So for now, ma'am, we are very much thankful on behalf of whole organizing team that such a distinguished speakers with us and making an excellent presentation and making this FDP a very meaningful and interesting, ma'am. So I'd like to express our deep gratitude to you, ma'am. Thank you very much for being with us, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. Thanks to all the participants for their participation and for the questions. There's some great questions there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for being.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for accepting our invite. And it's been a great session. We would like to stay connected with you for other events also of Department of Economics. And we'll keep on having great takeaways from your experience. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I just wanted to give an overview. I hope it has not been overwhelming. Since it was supposed to be an overview lecture, I tried to touch on several things. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye. Have a good day.
Ashish, sir, Edwin, please stop the live. Is there anyone available on admin part? Please stop the live. Anjali ma'am, is there anyone available?
I think the admin is there, but nobody is responding on the other side. I'll just see. Can be done.
Ma'am, I told Ashish sir to stop the live. So I think we should leave the meeting. He'll be stopping it.
Okay, then I am leaving the meeting. I think the live
okay.
is...
Yeah, already told. Already told.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.